The lock clicked open at 7 minutes past 8 on a gray October morning in Kansas City, Missouri, and every single person in that dim little hallway forgot how to breathe. Marcy Bishop stepped back without knowing she was stepping back. Officer Reyes lowered her flashlight, and Danny Walker, the night janitor, who had spent 3 weeks pretending he did not know a thing, opened his mouth to say, "Sorry," and could not make a sound come out. Before we go one step deeper into this story, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me what corner of the world you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. Because inside locker number 247, on a small nest made of a folded grey coat, lay a skinny brown mutt with rain still drying in his fur, one paw resting on top of a battered leather wallet, and a photograph tucked so carefully beneath his chin that anyone could see he had been guarding it. The dog did not growl. He did not tremble. He only lifted his head, looked past the strangers, and stared straight at Danny Walker, as if he had been waiting for Danny to explain to the grown-ups what he had already tried to explain to God. 3 weeks earlier, Danny had not known that dog existed. He was 59 years old, a wide man with sad brown eyes and hands the size of dinner plates, and he pushed his grey mop down the wet tile of the Greyhound station every night, from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning. He had done that same job for 11 years, ever since his wife Rose had passed and their little house had gone too quiet for him to sit in it. The station was noisy in a way that kept his mind from eating itself. Buses arrived at all hours, wheezing to a stop under the yellow lights, and the passengers came out blinking, dragging suitcases and small, tired children, smelling of diesel and cold coffee and long journeys. Danny liked them without needing to know them. He would nod and they would nod, and that was enough contact for one lifetime. He first noticed the scratching on a Tuesday, 20 minutes past 11, right after the last bus from St. Louis emptied out. A soft, thin sound near the wall of rented lockers at the back of the terminal, the kind of sound a person could easily blame on rats and pretend not to hear. Danny leaned his mop against a pillar and stood very still. Something small and low to the ground slipped between the row of orange plastic seats, paused, glanced at him with 2 shining eyes, and disappeared behind the metal lockers. Danny waited. He heard the tiny click of nails on tile, then the softer clink of a metal door easing open, then the whisper of that same door pulling gently shut, and then nothing. Only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faraway sigh of another bus starting somewhere in the dark. He walked over on careful boots and put his ear against locker number 247. On the other side of that cold metal, someone was breathing. Someone small, someone tired. Danny stood there for a long time. Then he went to the vending machines, bought a cheap ham sandwich, took the meat out of it, and left it on a paper napkin at the base of the locker. He put a small plastic bowl of water beside it. When he came back at 4 in the morning, the meat was gone and the bowl was empty. He should have told his supervisor, he knew that. But Danny Walker had not stopped feeling like a boy on the inside just because his outside had gone grey, and the boy inside remembered too well what it felt like to hide. So he told no one. Every night for the next 22 nights, he left a little food and a little water and a folded blanket where the security cameras did not reach. Every night, at the same hour, the small brown dog slipped out from between the benches, drank, ate, and returned to locker number 247 with a canvas strap held in his teeth so he could pull the door shut behind him. Danny did not try to touch him. He did not try to name him. He simply took to whispering, in a voice softer than his mop, "Sleep tight, buddy, I got you." The dog began to wait for that whisper. Danny could see him on the 3rd night and the 5th and the 10th, sitting very still with his chin on his paws inside the half-open door, ears cocked, watching the big janitor pass, waiting for those 2 words before he pulled the metal shut. Danny had not told a soul. That is why, on the morning Marcy Bishop called him into her small office, he felt his stomach drop right through the floor. Marcy was the new station manager, transferred in from a bigger terminal in Chicago. She was 52 years old, tall and straight-backed, with iron-grey hair cut short and reading glasses that lived on a chain around her neck. She wore a blue Greyhound uniform every single day and kept the sleeves ironed. The old-timers around the station had already decided she was going to be trouble because she did things by the book, and the book had not been opened in that terminal for a long time. But Marcy was not cruel. Danny had figured that out on her second day when she had noticed old Mr. Callahan, the retired boxer who slept on bench 8 when the shelters were full, and instead of throwing him out, she had quietly slid a paper cup of coffee onto the seat beside him and walked on. She saw everything. She just did not always tell you she had seen it. That morning she looked up from a printout on her desk and said, "Danny, sit down a minute, would you?" He sat. "I've been going through the rented lockers," she said. She tapped the paper. "Half of these haven't been paid on in years. Corporate wants a full inventory before the end of the month. We open the abandoned ones, we clear them out, and we free up the space." She paused. "You've worked back there for a long time. Anything I should know before I start?" Danny opened his mouth. He tried. He honestly tried. But every word he owned had suddenly rusted shut, and all that came out was a soft, useless sound. Marcy tilted her head. "Danny, there's a dog," he said finally. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "There's a dog," Danny repeated, and his big shoulders sagged, and his hands went flat on his knees like a man about to be sentenced. "In locker 247. He's been sleeping in there for weeks. He knows how to open it and close it. He doesn't bother nobody. He waits for the last bus, and then he goes in. I've been feeding him. I know I should have said something, ma'am. I know it. I couldn't figure how to say it without you having to do something about it." Marcy set her reading glasses down on top of the printout. For a long moment, she just looked at him, and Danny could not tell whether he was about to be fired or thanked or laughed out of the room. Then she said, very quietly, "Show me." He walked her back through the terminal on rubbery legs. It was 10 in the morning, the station bright and busy, travelers wheeling suitcases past the rows of chrome lockers without ever looking twice. Danny stopped in front of number 247 and pointed like a boy, showing a teacher his shame. Marcy crouched. She was not the crouching type, but she crouched anyway, and she put her ear against the metal, the way Danny had put his ear the very first night. She stayed there long enough that a woman with 2 toddlers had to walk around her, muttering. Then she straightened up, brushed her uniform pants smooth, and said in a normal voice, "All right, here's what we're going to do." Danny braced himself. "Policy says we open it," Marcy said, "because if I don't, and someone else finds him in there in a week, I lose my job and he loses his life. So we open it. But we open it properly, with a witness, and we do it in the morning when the terminal is calm, and if that dog is what you say he is, we figure out what's right after we know what's inside. Understood?" Danny nodded. He was still braced for the wrong thing to happen. "And Danny," she added softer, "you should have told me the first night. I would have done the same thing you did, only I would have brought a bigger bowl." That was when Danny knew that Marcy Bishop was not going to be trouble at all. They set it for the next morning at 8. Marcy called the local police non-emergency line and requested an officer to be present as a witness because Greyhound Corporate required it any time an abandoned locker was opened, in case the contents were criminal. The officer who came was a young Latina woman named Officer Elena Reyes, 28 years old, sharp-eyed, with a tight braid down her back and a soft mouth that did not smile easily. A locksmith met them at 7:45, an older man from a shop on Truman Road, with tired eyes and steady hands. Danny had not slept. He had gone home at 6 that morning, taken off his boots, and sat on the edge of his bed staring at the wall for 2 hours. Then he had come right back. He was not going to leave the small brown dog to face those strangers alone. They gathered by the locker at 8 sharp. The locksmith worked the pick, the pin turned, the door popped open with that soft metal sigh, and nobody moved. Because there was Scout. He was thinner than Danny had realized. In the ordinary shadows of night, Danny had only seen the flash of a small brown shape. Now, in the honest daylight of the terminal, he saw a mutt with the long legs of a hound and the boxy chest of something sturdier, ribs faintly visible under short brown fur, a white patch on his throat like a bib, and eyes the deep color of wet coffee. He had a torn ear. He had a small pale scar across his muzzle. He looked, in that first quiet moment, less like a lost animal and more like a soldier at attention. The nest under him was made of a folded grey wool coat, the kind a man might wear in winter to a job he was proud of. On top of the coat, tucked between Scout's front paws, sat a leather wallet worn at the corners and a photograph face down. Behind him, at the back of the locker, someone had placed a small bundle wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of white string, the whole thing sitting upright as if it had been set there on purpose. Marcy went to her knees on the dirty tile. She did not reach for the dog. She held out her hand, palm up, and waited, the way she must have waited for 100 wary things in her life. Scout stared at her for a long time. Then slowly he leaned his bony forehead against her palm and closed his eyes. He was so tired. Anyone could see it. He was so unspeakably tired. Officer Reyes cleared her throat. "May I?" she asked. Marcy nodded. Reyes crouched carefully and, with 2 gloved fingers, slid the wallet out from under Scout's paw. She turned the photograph over. It was a young man, 24, 25 maybe, wearing an army uniform, desert tan, sleeves rolled up. His hair was cropped short, dark blonde. He was grinning, the wide, unguarded grin of someone who has just been told he can go home. One arm was slung around a much younger, much healthier version of the very dog on that folded coat. Same white bib, same torn ear, only smaller then. The dog in the picture had one paw up on the young man's thigh, tongue out, eyes squinted with pure happiness. Reyes turned the photograph over. On the back, in careful blue ballpoint pen, someone had written, "For Buddy, in case I don't come home. His name is Scout. Please be kind." The 4 of them stood there and let that sink in. Reyes opened the wallet. A driver's license slid halfway out. Missouri issue. The address was a shelter over on East 12th. The picture matched. The name was Ethan Miller. Date of birth put him at 26 years old. Officer Reyes stepped away to make a phone call. She kept her voice low, but the terminal was quiet at that hour, and Danny heard the words all the same. "Yeah, I need a records pull. Ethan Miller, 26, Missouri. Address on East 12th, the shelter." "Yes, that one. Just tell me if you've got anything on him." A pause. Reyes closed her eyes. "How long ago? Are you sure?" Another pause. "Copy. Thank you." She came back. She did not look at the dog. She looked at Marcy. "Ethan Miller," she said, in the flat voice cops use when they cannot afford to feel yet, "died 8 months ago, complications from pneumonia. He'd been in and out of that shelter for about a year. 2 combat deployments, honorably discharged, no next of kin listed on the intake form. Nobody claimed the body. County buried him." Danny made a sound he did not know he was capable of. It was not a sob. It was the first crack of one, the sound a man makes when the crack starts, and he is still trying to hold the whole dam. Because now the arithmetic had come home to roost. 8 months, 240 nights. 240 nights, ever since the last time a young veteran named Ethan Miller had walked out of this station and never walked back in. That skinny brown dog had climbed into the last place on earth that still smelled like his person, curled around a wallet and a photograph and a small brown bundle, and waited. He had waited through August. He had waited through the 98-degree afternoons when the air in that metal box must have been an oven. He had waited through the September rains and the first cold snap of October. He had learned to nose the door open and pull it shut with his teeth, so no one would take away the coat that still smelled like the only human who had ever kept a promise to him. He had eaten what Danny could sneak him, and before Danny, he had eaten what he could find in the trash cans at the back of the terminal. He had not left, because Ethan had told him to be a good boy, and Scout had believed him. Danny put both hands over his face. Marcy, still on her knees, still with her palm against Scout's small warm head, did not cry. Not exactly. 2 tears slid down her cheeks in a straight line, and she did not brush them away, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "He comes home with me tonight," she said, "and tomorrow we find out what this brave boy needs." The locksmith looked at the floor. Officer Reyes nodded once, hard, and put the wallet and the photograph into a plastic evidence bag, but gently, the way you handle something breakable. She promised to try to locate any family Ethan might have had, promised to make it quick, promised to call the second she knew anything. Then Marcy did something none of them expected. She reached slowly into the back of the locker, unwrapped the small brown paper bundle, and looked inside. Danny watched her face change. He watched all the color leave it. She lifted out a folded piece of lined notebook paper, opened it with careful fingers, and read it silently. Her mouth pressed into a hard line. Then she folded it back up, the same folds Ethan had made, and put it in the pocket of her uniform shirt over her heart. "What was it?" Danny asked later when the locker was closed again and the locksmith was gone and the terminal was starting to fill with the 8:30 crowd. Marcy looked at him. "It was a letter," she said. "It was to whoever found the dog." She paused. "I'll read it out loud when the right people are here to hear it, not before." That was the first turn. That was where Danny thought the story ended, with a small brown dog going home, with a good woman in a blue uniform. But it was only the first turn because the story that Ethan Miller had left inside locker number 247 was much larger than a dog and a coat and a letter, and the world had not even started to hear it yet. Merci took Scout home to her small brick house on Bellefontaine Avenue that same evening. He rode in the passenger seat with a greyhound blanket wrapped around him, and he did not whine, and he did not shake. He simply watched the wet streets slide by with the calm patience of a creature who had already spent every emotion he owned. When she opened her front door, he walked in like he had lived there always. Sniffed the corners of each room, chose a spot on the rag rug near the radiator, lay down, and slept for 19 hours straight. She called her veterinarian, Dr. Ruth Aoki, who agreed to come by the next morning. Dr. Aoki was a small woman of about 60, with silver-streaked black hair, and hands so gentle that Scout let her touch him from the very first minute. She listened to his heart, ran her fingers along his spine, looked in his mouth. She sat back on her heels and did the long silence that veterinarians do when they are choosing kind words. "He's about 7 years old," she said finally. "He's underweight by 12 pounds. There's an old fracture in the left front leg that healed without a cast, so he'll always favor it a little. He's got a heart murmur, mild, nothing that will shorten his life if he's well cared for, and he's dehydrated." She looked at Marcy. "He needs food, warmth, quiet, and someone to trust. That's it. He'll do the rest himself. He's stronger than he looks." Marcy fed him small meals 4 times a day of soft rice and boiled chicken. She did not try to sleep in the same room as him at first. She thought he might feel trapped. But on the 4th night, she woke around 2 in the morning to find him standing very quietly beside her bed, watching her sleep the way he had once watched Danny walk past the locker. She patted the blanket. He jumped up so lightly she barely felt it. He circled once, tucked himself against the back of her knees, sighed, and did not move again until dawn. That was when Marcy Bishop began to cry properly. Not for the first time, just for the first time long and hard and without any dignity at all. She cried for Scout and for Ethan Miller and for her own son, Michael, who had died in a car accident in Chicago 6 years ago at the age of 21, and whose room she had not been able to walk into for 8 solid months afterward. She had never told anyone at the Kansas City station about Michael. She had transferred down here so she would not have to see his high school every morning on the way to work. She had not planned at 52 years old to fall in love with a starved little mutt who liked to sleep against the back of her knees. Life, however, had never once asked Marcy Bishop what she planned. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Officer Elena Reyes was making phone calls she did not want to make. It took her 4 days to find Susan Miller. Ethan's mother lived in Springfield, Missouri, in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on a fixed income of $1,100 a month from her late husband's veterans' benefits. She had not spoken to her son in the 11 months before his death. That was not because she had stopped loving him. That was because Ethan had come back from his second deployment a different person, and neither of them had known what to say to that different person, and every phone call had ended in hurt until neither of them could bear to place another one. Susan had gotten the news of his death from a county caseworker over the phone in a bright supermarket parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon, and she had dropped her bag of oranges on the pavement, and the oranges had rolled everywhere, and a stranger had picked them up for her, and that was as much of that day as she could remember. Officer Reyes drove down to Springfield on her day off in her own car, because that felt like the right way to do it. She sat on Susan Miller's floral couch with a cup of weak coffee, and she showed the photograph, and she showed the wallet, and she explained, as gently as anyone had ever explained anything, what Ethan's dog had done for 240 nights. Susan Miller made a sound that no cop ever forgets. It was not a scream. It was the sound of a mother's heart hitting a wall it had already hit once, remembering how to hit it again. She said when she could speak, "He wrote me a letter 3 months before he died. I never opened it. I was too angry. I thought it was another one where he was going to tell me the war wasn't his fault. I was so tired of being angry at a war that took my boy home and gave me back a stranger." She stood up, walked to a drawer, took out a plain white envelope, and handed it to Officer Reyes. It was still sealed. Reyes did not open it. She held it in both hands and said, "Mum, you should open this, not me." Susan sat back down. She opened it. Her lips moved as she read. Then she pressed the letter against her chest, closed her eyes, and said, "Officer, when can I meet the dog?" That was the second turn, and it should have been the last, and it would have been the last, except that the world does not let a story like this stay quiet. Because in the meantime, someone at the Greyhound station had told a friend, and the friend had told a cousin, and the cousin worked as an intern at the local NBC affiliate. On the following Monday, a young reporter named Jasmine Cole arrived at the terminal with a small camera crew and asked Marcy Bishop if she could please tell the story of the dog in locker 247. Marcy said no. She said no politely. She said no firmly. She said the family was still grieving and the dog was still adjusting, and she was not about to turn any of it into a spectacle for a 5 o'clock news slot. Jasmine Cole, 26, sharp and stubborn, did not argue. She thanked Marcy for her time, closed her notebook, and left. 3 hours later, Marcy's phone rang. It was corporate. A man named Blake Turnbull, regional director for Greyhound's Midwest operations based out of Dallas, wanted a full written report on what he was calling the locker incident. Marcy filed the report. She was scrupulous. She did not leave out a comma. She stated that the locker had been legally opened, that the contents had been documented, that the biological occupant, a domestic dog, had been rehomed with an employee at no cost to the company, and that she had personally paid for cleaning and any incidental damage. She copied Officer Reyes on the report. She thought that would be the end of it. 2 days later, Blake Turnbull himself walked into her office. He was 43 years old, tall, gym-thin, wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly salary, and he had a manila folder in his hand. "Ms. Bishop," he said, "we have a small problem." Marcy sat up straight. "The story is going to run whether we want it to or not," Blake said. "A reporter has been asking questions in Springfield. She has spoken with the veteran's mother. Corporate legal is concerned about liability. There has been, apparently, an animal living inside company property for 8 months, and we cannot be seen to have discovered that only because a janitor happened to feed it." His face was very neutral. "We are going to get ahead of this. That means a controlled statement, a controlled interview, and the dog is going to be handed over to a proper animal welfare organization, not kept as a pet by an employee. It looks bad, Ms. Bishop. It looks like we are profiting from tragedy," Marcy said, without raising her voice at all. "You are not taking that dog." Blake Turnbull smiled, the tight, patient smile of a man who had heard many people say many things that had not come true. "Ms. Bishop, I am not asking. This is a directive from corporate. If you cannot comply, we will find someone who can." He set the manila folder on her desk. Inside was a formal notice giving her 72 hours to surrender Scout to a designated animal welfare partner or face termination. Marcy looked at the paper. She looked at Blake Turnbull. She looked in her mind's eye at a small brown dog sleeping against the back of her knees at 2 in the morning. Then she stood up, walked around her desk, opened her office door, and said, in the voice a woman uses when she has already made a decision she cannot unmake, "Mr. Turnbull, I have worked for Greyhound for 27 years. In that time, I have covered for this company through weather delays and food poisoning and one very ugly assault case, and I have never asked for a single favor in return. I'm asking now. I'm asking you to leave that little dog alone." Blake said, 72 hours, Miss Bishop." He left. Marcy stood in the middle of her office for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Danny Walker. "Danny," she said, "we have a problem." Danny came in early that night before his shift, wearing the good shirt he wore to church funerals. He sat across from Marcy and listened. When she was done, he did not say anything for a full minute. He just looked at his hands on his knees and thought. Then he said, "Ma'am, that dog is not going anywhere. Danny, they can fire me. They can fire you. They can send someone to my house with a legal order. They can send whoever they want," Danny said. "I said, I got you to that dog for 22 nights running. He heard me. He believed me. I am not making a liar of myself in front of an animal who has been lied to enough for one lifetime." Marcy stared at him. Then slowly she began to laugh. It was a small, watery laugh, but it was a laugh, and it was the first one that office had heard in a long time. "All right," she said, "all right then, Danny. If we're going to fight them, we're going to fight them smart." That night, Marcy did something completely unlike Marcy Bishop. She called back Jasmine Cole, the young reporter, and invited her over for coffee. They sat at Marcy's kitchen table with a plate of fig Newtons between them and Scout asleep on the rug. Marcy did not tell Jasmine what corporate had done. Not yet. She only asked, "How do you tell a story like this without turning it into a circus?" Jasmine, who had expected a fight, blinked. She thought for a while. Then she said, "You tell it with the mother. You let Susan Miller read her son's letter on camera. You don't zoom in on the dog crying because the dog isn't crying. The dog is finally not crying. You let people understand what waiting means. And you don't ask for donations because that's what turns it into a circus. You ask viewers to check on the veterans they know. That's it." Marcy said, "You do it that way?" Jasmine said, "That is the only way I do it." Marcy took her measure for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone and called Susan Miller in Springfield. Susan agreed the next morning. She said her son had been silenced for too long, and if his dog story could make one other mother pick up the phone before it was too late, she wanted the world to hear it. The piece aired 10 days later on a Tuesday evening. It was 6 minutes long. Jasmine kept her promise. There were no violins on the soundtrack, no slow-motion shots of Scout looking tragic. There was Danny wiping his eyes with the back of his big hand, saying, "I only left him a sandwich. He's the one who did the hard part." There was Susan Miller, sitting on Marcy's couch with the letter on her lap, reading her son's words out loud in a voice that did not tremble. There was Marcy at the very end, with Scout leaning against her shin, saying quietly, "If you know a veteran, call him. Not tomorrow. Today. Do not wait until a dog has to do it for you." By 10 o'clock that night, the segment had been viewed 800,000 times online. By the next morning, it had been viewed 4 million. By Thursday, Greyhound Corporate had received 17,000 emails, phone calls, and letters, none of them praising the 72-hour ultimatum. Blake Turnbull called Marcy at 9:10 on Thursday morning. He did not say hello. "Miss Bishop," he said, "we appear to have miscalculated." "Yes, sir," Marcy said. "You appear to have." There was a long pause. "The dog," Blake said, "will stay with you. Corporate will be issuing a statement of support this afternoon. We would appreciate your cooperation in that statement." "You'll have it," Marcy said, "on one condition." Blake sighed. "Which is?" "Locker 247, Marcy said, "does not get rented again, ever. It gets a small brass plaque on the door with Ethan Miller's name and dates. It stays exactly the way he left it, minus what belongs to his mother. That locker is a monument now. It is not for sale." Blake was silent for a long time. Danny, who was standing in the doorway of Marcy's office because he had been unable to make himself go home, held his breath. "Corporate will agree to that," Blake said finally. "You have my word." "I want it in writing, sir," Marcy said. "You'll have it," Blake said, and this time there was something almost like respect in his voice. Marcy hung up. She put both hands flat on her desk and let her shoulders drop for the first time in days. Danny walked over, took her hand in his big, careful paw, squeezed it once, and let go. "Mom," he said, "we won." "We won a round, Danny," Marcy said. "The story ain't over." She was right, because on Friday afternoon, a man walked into the Greyhound station in Kansas City, Missouri, and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. He was in his late 30s, muscular, sunburned, wearing jeans and a plain green Army-issue t-shirt. He had a duffel bag over one shoulder and an expression that could not decide whether to be furious or heartbroken. "My name is Nathan Cooper," he said when Marcy came out to meet him. "I served with Ethan Miller, and I need to see that dog." Marcy sat him down in her office. She poured him a paper cup of the terrible break-room coffee. She let him breathe. Nathan Cooper had served 2 deployments with Ethan Miller in the same infantry unit. They had been closer than brothers, closer than family, in the way that only men who have carried each other under fire ever are. Nathan had been the one to introduce Ethan to Scout. Scout, back then, had been a puppy at a kill shelter in San Antonio, Texas, where the unit had been stationed between deployments. The puppy had been slated for euthanasia the following morning. Nathan had wanted to adopt him himself, but he had a lease that forbade dogs, and he had shown the puppy to Ethan, and Ethan had gone down on one knee in that shelter and let the little dog climb onto his boot. And that had been that. Ethan and Scout had been inseparable for 2 years. When Ethan's second deployment came, Nathan had kept Scout in Texas with him, technically off-lease and quietly, and had shipped him back to Ethan the day Ethan got home. Then Ethan had begun to spiral. Nathan had watched it happen from Texas. He had called, he had written, he had flown up to Kansas City twice on his own dime. He had tried to talk Ethan into moving down south, into getting help through the VA, into anything. Ethan had refused each time, politely, gently, in the tone of a man who did not want to burden his friend with a fight he was already losing. Nathan had gotten the news of Ethan's death by text message, a one-line text from a mutual friend. He had not been on the notification list because he was not family, and Ethan had listed no next of kin. "I've been trying to find Scout for 6 months, Nathan said. His hands were wrapped around the paper cup so tightly the seam was starting to crack. I called every shelter, every pound. I called the shelter on East 12th. They said they hadn't seen a dog with Ethan. I thought he stopped. He looked at the ceiling. I thought he died out there somewhere, alone. I hated myself for 6 months for not driving up here the day I got the text. Marcy did not speak. There was no room in the air for her to. I saw the news piece on Tuesday night, Nathan went on. My wife made me sit down before she played it. I watched it and I couldn't move. I drove up from Fort Hood yesterday. I got in at 3 this morning. I've been sitting in my truck outside since sunrise trying to figure out what to say. He looked up at Marcy. His eyes were wet, but his voice was very steady. Ma'am, I am not here to take him from you. I read what you said in the paper. I know what you and that janitor did for him. I would give my right arm to know he is with someone who understands what he is. I am not here to take him. He swallowed. I just wanted to see him, just for a minute, so I can tell my wife I saw him with my own eyes. Marcy stood up. She said, "Come with me." She drove him to her house. Scout was in the yard, sniffing along the fence line in that slow, methodical way he had. When Nathan Cooper walked around the side of the house and Scout looked up, something happened that Marcy would tell her sister about weeks later, still shaking her head, still saying, "I never seen anything like it in my life." Scout froze. His ears came up. His tail did not wag. It went very stiff and very slow, one high, slow arc, and then his whole small body began to tremble, and he took one careful step forward, and then another, and then he ran, low and hard, straight across that yard. And Nathan Cooper went down on his knees in the wet October grass, and the dog hit him at the chest and knocked him back onto his heels, and Nathan wrapped both arms around him, and Scout did something Marcy had never heard him do. He cried. He made a small, broken sound in the back of his throat, a soft, high whine that was not fear, that was not pain, that was the sound of a creature saying, "You came, you finally came, I knew someone would come." Nathan Cooper, 39 years old, decorated combat veteran of 2 deployments, put his face into that dog's neck and wept like a boy. Marcy walked back into her kitchen and quietly closed the door to give them the yard. That should have been the perfect scene. It was the 3rd turn, and any weaker story would have ended there, with a soldier and a dog reunited on a lawn. But Marcy Bishop, watching them through the kitchen window with her fingers pressed against her mouth, was already thinking a thought she did not want to think. The thought was, he belongs to Nathan, not legally. Legally, Scout was Marcy's now. Susan Miller had signed him over. There were papers. There was a microchip in the works. Marcy had every right to keep him, but belonging is not a legal question. And Marcy Bishop, who had walked away from her own son's empty bedroom in Chicago because she could not bear the weight of what she owed him, knew the difference between owning a thing and being the right home for it. She let Nathan stay until the yard grew dark. She made him a proper dinner. She listened to the stories he told about Ethan, the funny ones, the reckless ones, the ones about a big-hearted young man who had loved his dog more than he loved himself. She poured him another cup of coffee at 9 o'clock, and then at 10, when Nathan was standing at her door with his duffel bag on his shoulder and Scout leaning against his shin, she said the hardest sentence of her whole adult life. "Nathan, take him home." Nathan Cooper stared at her. "Ma'am, no, I can't do that. I came to see him. I can't take your dog." "He isn't my dog," Marcy said. "He's Ethan's dog, and Ethan gave him to you a long time ago. You just didn't know it yet." "Ms. Bishop." "Nathan," Marcy said, "I have a beautiful little animal in my kitchen who has been waiting for someone who smells like his person. You smell like his person. You smell like the years of his life he loved best. I am 52 years old. I know what I want and I know what he wants. And what he wants is not the same thing. You take him home and you send me a picture every Sunday and you come see me at Christmas, and that will be enough." Nathan opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the dog. Scout was pressing so hard against his shin that Nathan actually had to shift his weight to stay upright. "On one condition," Nathan said finally, and his voice was cracking. "Name it." "Every summer," he said, "he comes and stays with you for 2 weeks, full 2 weeks. My wife and I will drive him up here ourselves. He needs to know you are his too. He needs to know he has more than one safe place. He has been unsafe long enough." Marcy nodded once. She could not speak. They shook hands at the door. Nathan lifted Scout into the passenger seat of his truck. The little brown dog stood on the seat for a long time and looked back at the front window of Marcy's house. Marcy stood there and lifted one hand. Scout put one paw against the truck window. Then Nathan pulled away. Marcy went back inside, sat down on the rug where Scout had slept, and cried without stopping until 3 in the morning. But that was still not the end of the story, because the story of locker number 247 had already begun to change other people, and those other people had not finished their part yet. Danny Walker was the first. On the Monday after Scout left for Texas, Danny came into Marcy's office and set a small, folded piece of paper on her desk. It was a check. It was made out to a local shelter for $800. "Danny, what is this?" "That's what I had saved for a new water heater," Danny said. "My old one works fine another year. I want to sponsor 8 dogs at that shelter over on East 12th. Any dog they can't move, they call me, and I go sit with him for an hour. I already talked to the director. She said yes." Marcy looked up at him. "Danny." "I got a lot of nights in me still, ma'am," Danny said. "I might as well spend some of them with the ones nobody's coming for. That way, if I ever find another one waiting in a locker, I already know what to say to him." He walked out before she could answer. Susan Miller was the second. 2 weeks after the news piece, she called Marcy and said she had gotten letters, hundreds of them, from mothers of veterans all over the country, from wives, from fathers, from sons and daughters. Every letter said some version of the same thing, that Ethan's story had made them pick up a phone they had not been able to pick up in months or years. Susan Miller, at 61 years old, on a fixed income of $1,100 a month, sat down at her kitchen table with a stack of stationery and began to answer every single one of them by hand. She was still answering them a year later. She said it was the first work she had had in a long time that felt like a life. Jasmine Cole was the third. She quit the local NBC affiliate 3 months later and went to work for a non-profit that produced short documentaries about veteran mental health. She said the 6 minutes of Ethan Miller's story had ruined her, in the good way, for the kind of news that leaves people less human than it found them. Blake Turnbull was the fourth, and this was the one nobody saw coming. 6 weeks after the story broke, he flew up to Kansas City on his own dime, walked into the terminal at 7 in the morning and asked to speak with Marcy Bishop. He was not wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans and a plain black jacket. He looked, for the first time since Marcy had met him, like a person and not a policy. "Ms. Bishop," he said, "I owe you an apology." Marcy poured him a cup of coffee and let him sit with it. "I have a son," Blake said. "He is 24 years old. He came home from Afghanistan last year. He lives in my basement. He does not answer his phone when his mother calls him. He does not answer when I call him." He set the coffee down. "When I gave you that ultimatum, I already knew what I was doing was wrong. I just did not know it out loud. Watching that news segment, watching that mother read that letter, I heard my own son's voice in every silence between her words. I went home that night and I sat on the floor outside my son's basement door for 4 hours until he opened it. I have been trying since that day to be a father to a stranger. I'm not going to pretend I have gotten anywhere. I'm only going to tell you that I am trying, and that you and Danny Walker and a small brown dog are the reason I started." He stood up. "The plaque is being cast. It will be installed next Thursday. I will be there if you'll have me." Marcy stood up too. She reached out and shook his hand. "Mr. Turnbull," she said, "please bring your boy, if he'll come. There will be room." The plaque ceremony took place on a bright, cold Thursday morning in late November. The whole station shut down for 1 hour. Corporate paid for the closure. Susan Miller came up from Springfield in a black wool coat. Officer Elena Reyes came in her dress uniform. Danny Walker came in the good shirt he wore to church funerals, cleaned and pressed. Dr. Ruth Aoki came from her clinic. Jasmine Cole came with a small camera and no crew because she was there as a person and not a reporter. Blake Turnbull came, and beside him, walking slowly and carefully, was a young man in a grey hoodie who did not say much, but who nodded when Marcy shook his hand and said, "Thank you for coming, Michael." His name was Michael Turnbull. Marcy would not, for the rest of her life, get used to that coincidence, and she would not stop believing it was a kindness from somewhere. And Nathan Cooper came, up from Fort Hood, driving all night, with his wife Rebecca in the passenger seat and a small brown dog on Rebecca's lap. Scout had gained 15 pounds. His coat was thick and glossy. He walked into that terminal with the calm, easy stride of a creature who has finally understood that the world does not end every time a person walks out a door. He greeted Danny first. He put his front paws up on Danny's knees, and Danny, huge Danny, went down on the tile and let the dog lick the tears off his big brown face without a single word between them. Then Scout went to Marcy. He did not jump. He walked over slowly, sat down at her feet, and leaned his forehead against her shin, exactly the way he had leaned it against her palm on the morning the locker had opened. "There you are," Marcy said softly. "There you are, buddy." The plaque was a simple thing. Brushed brass, mounted on the door of locker number 247 in small, clean letters. It read, "Locker 247, reserved in memory of Sergeant Ethan Miller, United States Army, and in honor of Scout, who waited." Below that, in slightly smaller letters, someone had added a second line that Marcy had insisted on. "If you are waiting too, please ask us for help. You are not alone in this building." Beside the plaque, at Marcy's request, Corporate had installed a small brass plate with 2 phone numbers on it. One was the number for the National Veterans Crisis Line. The other was the direct extension for the office of the station manager, 24 hours a day, because Marcy Bishop had made it a standing order that anyone who walked up to that locker looking lost would be walked to a warm chair and offered a cup of coffee, no questions asked, until somebody who could actually help had been called. Susan Miller was the one who unveiled the plaque. She pulled the small white cloth away with her steady, spotted hands, and she stepped back, and she read her son's name out loud, and she smiled the smile of a mother who has finally, after 8 long months, gotten to say her boy's name in public. Then she turned to Scout, and she went down onto the tile in her black wool coat, and she took the little brown dog's face in both hands and pressed her forehead against his. "Thank you," she said, "for staying with him, and thank you for coming to get me. I was waiting too, I just didn't know it." Scout licked her cheek once. It was the softest sound in that whole cold, echoing terminal. Nathan Cooper stood behind them with his hand on his wife's shoulder. Rebecca was crying quietly. Nathan was not crying anymore. Nathan had done his crying in October in a wet yard in Missouri. Now he was simply standing very still, watching his best friend's mother press her forehead against his best friend's dog, and he was letting himself, finally, believe that a small good thing had come out of a very large bad one. Danny Walker walked the whole party over to bench 8, where the coffee had been laid out on a folding table. Blake Turnbull's son, Michael, who had not spoken all morning, walked at the very back of the group. He was walking very slowly. His hands were deep in the pockets of his grey hoodie. Danny slowed down and matched his pace, and after a while Danny said without looking at him, "I work nights here. If you ever can't sleep, you come by. I got a corner near the vending machines where nobody bothers me. I make bad coffee. You'd be welcome." Michael Turnbull did not answer for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you, sir." He came by 3 weeks later. and then again the week after that, and then again. The story of locker number 247 kept happening, quietly, for years. Marcy Bishop did not, in the end, keep Scout, but every summer, for the next 6 summers, Nathan and Rebecca Cooper drove up from Fort Hood with a small brown dog in the back seat, and Scout spent 2 weeks in the little brick house on Bellefontaine Avenue, sleeping against the back of Marcy's knees the way he had learned to do that first cold October week. Every Sunday, Marcy's phone chimed with a new picture, sometimes of Scout on a couch, sometimes of Scout on a lake dock, sometimes of Scout with a tiny toddler asleep in the curl of his belly, because Nathan and Rebecca had a daughter now, a little girl they had named Sky, and Sky's very first word had been not mama and not dada, but coo, which was as close as her small pink mouth could get to Scout. Danny Walker kept working nights at the Kansas City terminal for another 7 years. He kept sponsoring dogs at the shelter on East 12th. When he finally retired at 66, the shelter named their long-stay kennel after him. He went in every Tuesday and Friday afternoon for the rest of his life to sit with the dogs nobody was coming for, and he told each of them, in his soft, low voice, "I got you, buddy. I got you." Susan Miller answered every letter she got, until her arthritis made it too hard to hold a pen, and then she started dictating them to a young woman from her church, and she never stopped. On the mantel of her small apartment above the laundromat, she kept 3 things: a folded American flag, a photograph of a smiling young soldier with his arm around a skinny brown dog, and a plaster paw print that Marcy had mailed her one Christmas, taken from Scout's own small, careful paw. Underneath the paw print, Marcy had written, in blue ballpoint pen, the same words Ethan had once written on the back of a photograph: "Please be kind." Blake Turnbull and his son Michael went to family therapy together for 2 full years. Michael went back to school at 26. He's a social worker now at a veterans outreach program in Dallas, Texas. He tells his clients sometimes about a small brown dog who waited 240 nights inside a bus station locker because he thinks it helps them understand something about loyalty that speeches cannot say. Jasmine Cole made 4 more short documentaries about veteran mental health. One of them won a small national award. She dedicated it, in the credits, to the dog who taught me the difference between a story and a person. Officer Elena Reyes became Sergeant Elena Reyes 4 years later. She keeps a copy of that photograph of Ethan and Scout in the top drawer of her desk. She looks at it sometimes when she has to deliver bad news to someone's mother. And every night, at 11 o'clock on the dot, when the last Greyhound bus rolled into the Kansas City terminal in the slow silver rain of some October evening, Marcy Bishop, who worked at that station for another 9 years before she retired, would walk down the long row of chrome lockers with a warm cup of coffee in her hand. She would stop at locker number 247. She would put her palm flat against the small brass plaque with Ethan Miller's name on it. She would stand there for exactly 1 minute in the quiet after the last passengers had shuffled out into the wet street, and she would say softly, the way Danny Walker had once said it in the dark, "I got you, buddy. I got you." And somewhere in a house in Texas, on a warm rug in front of a heater, a small brown dog with a torn ear and a white patch on his throat would lift his head at exactly that hour every single night. As if he had heard her, his tail would thump once against the rug. Then he would settle his chin down onto the boot of a sleeping soldier, and he would close his coffee-colored eyes, and he would sleep, safe at last, finally, truly, home. That is the story of locker number 247, the story of a young man named Ethan Miller who could not stay long enough, and the story of the small brown dog named Scout who stayed for him. It is the story of a big janitor with a soft heart who left a sandwich in the dark, and of a straight-backed station manager who cried on a dirty tile floor, and of a soldier who drove all night from Texas because 6 minutes of television had told him where his brother's dog was still breathing. It is a story about waiting and about being found, and about the small, unremarkable people who happen in the middle of the ordinary weather of an ordinary Tuesday to save each other simply by refusing to look away. If this story moved you, take one small step today. Call a veteran you know. Call a friend you have not spoken to in too long. Sit down with the person in your own house who is quietly waiting for you to notice. Do not wait for a small brown dog to have to do it for you. And if you have made it all the way here to the end with me, do me one last kindness. Hit the like button, leave a comment telling me what part stayed with you, and subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling stories that remind us how much good we are still capable of, even in the coldest October rain. Take care of each other out there. I will see you in the next one.